Hello, this is an audio-visual presentation of my results and a discussion on the findings of my research project entitled Listen to Us, Challenging Colonial Legacies and Reframing African Poverty in British NGO Fundraising Appeals. This presentation will advance the core arguments of my research, utilising the breadth of my reading, critical engagement with scholars, and the lived experiences expressed by the international development experts I interviewed. The presentation will be structured in relation to key themes. In these subsections, I will discuss the corresponding media assets I have produced. These themes and creative pieces respond directly to my final research objective, which is to create an alternative media product guided by existing literature and the direction received from interviews with field experts. This alternative media product is a social media campaign by the fictional grassroots NGO Action Fund Zambia. It is to be hosted on Instagram in aid of the climate-induced food crisis in Zambia. The assets include 3 Instagram stories and 1 Instagram post. The themes embody my recommendations to development media practitioners and are as follows: to incite advocacy and activism over patronage, to honour the complexity of poverty and neo-colonial impacts, and to represent beneficiaries of aid with agency and dignity. I will now begin. My first theme and recommendation is to incite advocacy and activism over patronage. This ideal is embodied in 2 of my final media assets. Both Said and Korf advance the notion of passivity in mediated depictions of African AIDS recipients. Hopeless and awaiting a saviour, NGOs often show us Africans starving and suffering. On poverty porn, participant C said, "There is a visual focus on the destitute African in crisis, rather than on their ability to thrive when provided with essential resources." With regards to representation of children specifically, participant A said, "Every time I think of poverty porn, I envision a little kid from Africa who is malnourished, a fly is perched on their eyeball and their nose is running." Participant G advised, "Try to include people looking like they have destiny over their own situations." This guidance shaped the Instagram post I curated. I chose the antithesis of the powerless African child. Instead, we see a child activist, a politically active demonstrator, shouting and shaping his own future. He is angry and animated, not docile and passive. Participant B said, "Help people become their own agents." This heavily influenced my choice of language and call to action. It says, "Fight climate change with us, not for us." The use of "with" here evokes a sense of collaboration. The promotion asks its audience to stage a partner demonstration, so the charity thus functions as a conduit for grassroots engagement with Indigenous activist groups. This approach fosters dialogue, negotiation, and empathy. The funding request is purposefully the final text in this appeal. As Hirsch said, Africans are not waiting for handouts from Western saviours. They want political solutions and meaningful advocacy. From a creative stance, I believe the red visually communicated the climate crisis effectively. The main font I used, and have used across all creative assets, is Barrio, chosen for its warmth and rhythmic communication style. The second creative asset that embodies this theme of eliciting activism over patronage is the Instagram story you can see here. I once again selected an image from a demonstration, this time of a young black woman holding a climate justice sign, chanting with her fist raised in the air. This bears a powerful visual parallel with the Black Power salute, a symbol of resistance against white supremacy and unity and defiance. This visual pastiche of a black liberation movement thus has post-colonial potential. Power acknowledged the usefulness in portraying an understanding of racial dynamics and colonial histories in NGO work. She, like the young boy in the previous asset, is active and political. Participant A emphasized the importance of encouraging political action and solidarity in campaign imagery, saying, appeals have to be political to some extent. Ultimately, without real policy changes, it's just charity, a short-term fix. My goal in this post was thus to galvanize public support and to lobby in service of actionable goals on climate change. Participant E raised the issue of photographing powerful subjects, only then to be reframed as victims. She said, we used images of advocates who are empowered people, but they were rebranded to appear vulnerable. The activists were naturally angered by this. To avoid this, I chose to maintain the original context of this photograph and to visually highlight her striking stance. According to Hetherington and Law, the human agency of African communities should direct how British NGOs behave in the Global South. So once more, I used the hashtag #OrganiseWithZambia and asked the audience to stage a partner demonstration through a community consultation process. On the question of what beneficiaries want, participant A said, I think they want advocates, not donors. I believe this creative asset embodies that spirit. The next theme and recommendation in my discussion is to honour the complexity of poverty and neo-colonial impacts. As highlighted by Mola, Manzo and Gidley, many NGO appeals in Britain's history have deliberately simplified the causes of poverty and its solutions. This obscuring of Britain's past in Africa and of these residual talons of colonial domination, as I once put it, are notably absent both in how NGOs think about poverty and in how they represent it through their communications. Participant B said, this is the key to marketing and PR. It's how NGOs act like businesses, through simplifying an issue and pulling on heartstrings. This is very similar to Kapoor's vision of the corporate charity, in sacrificing the philanthropic spirit to a measured, profit-driven capitalist model. I wanted to abandon this approach, addressing the geopolitical complexity of climate change and its impact on the food crisis in Zambia. Participant H said, when I talk to people about what I have seen on deployments, even that imagery only goes so far. People do not understand the scale of how bad it is. So, in this asset, I sought to demystify the issue in question in a visually simple way. The text articulates how little Africa contributes to global emissions, and yet how they will face the most severe consequences of climate change. I also positioned the West as largely responsible for this, with their huge carbon footprint and the high levels of industrial pollution in the region. In identifying these unfair relations of power, participant B said, if you can, create space for an acknowledgement of systemic issues and colonial histories. On communicating sustainable development options, participant A said, these problems are not going to be fixed with a simple donation of money. People need to know this and to be aware of the broader landscape. Participant D added to this encouragement and said, the geopolitical context of the region you are representing, the complexities of their circumstances, this needs some attention too. This guidance shaped my decision to truly explain the crisis and to acknowledge that the emergency funds requested in this call to action will solve only the secondary issue, which is hunger. By combining the desire to provide an immediate disaster relief response with the impetus to act on the core issue, which is climate change, the appeal is both humanitarian and political. I also featured the map of Africa to dispel the image of Africa held in the Western imagination, one of homogeneous sameness. The final theme and recommendation I will explore in my discussion is perhaps the most important point of all: to represent beneficiaries of aid with agency and with dignity. As proposed by Mueller, the formulaic and highly constructed African victim, features widely in NGO campaign materials. This neo-colonial trope positions the global north as active and the global south as passive. I wanted to disrupt this false dichotomy by creating empowered imagery in my final creative asset. My choice of subject was inspired by the powerful advice of my respondents. Participant A said, "Your advocate should be an Indigenous expert, someone with both lived experience and specialist knowledge." Participant H implored me to use diasporic voices, while Participant B powerfully said, "It has to be from the people, by the people, for the people." Namely, I drew on the advice of Participant G, who underscored the importance of finding trustworthy messengers. Describing the process, she said, "It's like a chart. On one axis you have competency, and on the other you have warmth. A credible messenger must rank highly in these categories in order to gain public trust. Engagement requires trust." Thus, I chose to depict a climate scientist whose fictional education was funded by an Action Fund scholarship. She is smiling comfortably, healthy, glowing. This imagery is entirely positive. I chose the text, "I am a scientist, I am a climate justice leader," paired with the image of an empowered, modern woman, to visually refute the exposed, bare-breasted, exploited, patriarchal and archaic stereotype of African women that is often depicted in charity appeals, as described by Gidley. I would have commissioned this shot from a Zambian photographer. Participant F principally emphasized the importance of hiring Indigenous creatives, stating, "Over time, creative output will start to reflect the way Africans see themselves, instead of being stuck in this post-colonial view of the world, which despite the best of intentions, we are still in." A local creative sees their surroundings as familiar, and this natural gaze will produce far less ethnocentric imagery. The call to action is monetary, but it is a sustainable development program. Visually, I chose green because it invokes nature, relating to climate change, and it complements the composition of my image. Overall, I believe these recommendations are valuable, as although they are my creation, they embody the insights, visions, and hopes of field experts and scholars. Ultimately, African people deserve to be represented with dignity, context, and agency. I hope these findings are useful to development media practitioners and that this research provides a real contribution to development studies. Thank you for listening.